Hi, this is Medusa. It's the result of a collaboration between Dreadbox, which among other things makes analog synths, and PolyEnd, which among other things make simple but powerful sequencers. And in terms of thinking differently, it's one of the more interesting synths of 2018. And that's because of this one feature, which you obviously can't miss, and that's the grid, along with the way that it talks to the rest of the synth. They call it a hybrid synth, and it is indeed a combination of a few things. It's got both analog and digital oscillators, it's both monophonic and polyphonic or paraphonic, depending on your definition of those terms. And there's of course its main feature, the grid, which combined makes it both a synth that you can control with external keyboards, a grid that can be used to control external synths, but mainly a grid designed to control the synth itself. Now, before I dive into each of the parts, let's look at it overall. On the synth side, you have 6 oscillators, 3 Dreadbox analog oscillators, 3 digital oscillators from PolyEnd, and a noise generator with mixer to control their levels. It's got a resonant multi-mode analog filter, 5 LFOs with a cool twist, which I'll talk about, 5 envelopes, which are 5 stage envelopes, including delay and looping, 3 play modes, mono, 3-note, and 6-note. For the analog oscillators, you've got exponential FM, both for the oscillators and for the filter cutoff, as well as analog oscillator sync. And on the digital side, there's a little wavetable synth thrown in just for fun. There are 2 OLED screens, one for synth parameters and another for grid and general controls, and of course there's the grid itself. Now, Medusa has the ability to save and quickly flip between presets, and there's a lot more going on here, but before I talk about that, let's take a look at the grid. First, from a hardware perspective, each pad is a backlit silicon mini controller with X, Y, and Z sensitivity. They're slightly squishy, but have no travel, and they're flush with the surface, so slides and motions up and down, or around and around, are fairly easy. So that's the grid from a hardware side, but what's more interesting is what's going on the control and software side. The grid has 2 modes, note mode, which is what you see here, and if you press this button, it goes into grid mode. Let's start with the easier one, which is note mode. In note mode, Medusa plays the same sound no matter which pad you press. And this note-based grid layout is very similar to other grid-based controllers like the Instrument, Ableton Push, and the Launchpad. The idea is that you can configure any number of scales, and the notes will arrange themselves accordingly, as well as any tuning difference between the rows. I prefer 5, but you can choose any number from 1 to 7. When you have a typical scale selected and a 7-note difference, then each row represents an octave, and you have essentially 8 octaves up and down. I think there are a lot of advantages to this type of layout, especially if you come from a guitar background, and if you choose a chromatic scale, then basically these 4 rows are sort of like a bass guitar, or all the rows are configured very similarly to a guitar where each row represents a string, and then you can play the same shapes to get chords. And once you get to learn basic shapes, for example, this is a major chord, then you can transpose it just by moving the shape across the grid. This, for example, is a minor shape. It's also really nice to just set this to a scale. If you're in a band and they come up and say, oh, you know, we'll play the blues, then basically any note you play will be right. Now, if this format intimidates you, no worries, you can always go back to using a keyboard, but you will need to learn your scales and notes on this. Now, the advantage to playing here, aside from the easy chord shapes and the scales, is of course the expressive nature of the pads. You can configure each of the X, Y, and Z parameters of the pads to target any one of a number of parameters. So for example, if I wanted Z, how hard I press or aftertouch, to target the filter cutoff, I would do this. And now I'm using aftertouch to open and close the filter. To give you another example, I'll take the left-right motion, or X-axis motion, and use it to change the pitch. You can use the amount parameter to control how extreme the pitch bends are. And this is of course in addition to the aftertouch motion with the filter. So that's note mode. Now let's talk about what I think is the most innovative part of Medusa, and that's grid mode. So what is the grid, you ask? Well, it's a few things. First, it's a view into the sequencer where each pad represents a step. But then it's also an instrument on its own because each pad can be configured to play either a completely different sound or a completely different modulation configuration. So let's start simple. Let's start with a sequencer. I will create a sequence that is 12 steps long, and then I can record it either in note mode or using an external keyboard. Currently step by step, so I just engage recording and then sophisticated stuff. And now I can play this. Right? Simple. But if I go back into grid mode, I can play every note of the sequence, and obviously not in sequence. So you can see where this gets way more interesting than just a regular sequencer. But there's more to it because I can take any synth parameter and modify it on a step-by-step basis. So to take a simple example, if I wanted to have a different cutoff frequency for each step in the sequence, then this is what I'd get. And of course these pads are playable similarly as well. If you're familiar with the electron machines, this is very similar to parameter locking, only here it's called parameter modifications. Now, since this applies to any one of the synth parameters, let me load up something I prepared. You can create, for example, a drum kit. Forgive this snare, please. Now, aside from playing these live, I can also drag and drop them onto a short sequence. So I'll create a sequence that is 8 steps long. And then by holding a note, it can be copied, say, to here. And now it's part of this sequence. I'll take the hats, copy them across here. Okay, and take my fancy snare and copy it here. A masterpiece, I'm sure you'll agree. Now these pads can do more than just store sounds, they can also store just modulations without sounds. So for example, I will record a simple chord into here. And now I'll take some other pads and I'll record parameter modifications into them without any notes. And then when I play a note, I can use the pads just to modify parameters. And you can apply this to any parameter on the board, for example, an LFO. So this is a really nice way to make modulation presets. So now I've got a chord here and modulations here. This one with an LFO. And you can see that pads with modulations aren't as bright as pads with notes. And if I were to copy this pad into here and then add a modulation to it, then you can see that this pad would be slightly brighter than this one. Hopefully the camera does justice to the brightness difference between this pad, and this pad. Now, a little trick that I discovered is that you can sequence modulations, and then when you play with an external keyboard, You can have the modulations run one sequence while you're playing another. So that's pretty cool. So those more or less are the features of the grid, and I'm sure I've only scratched the surface of what can be done with this creatively. Now let's move on to the synth portion and see what Medusa can do from a sonic perspective. Let's start with the oscillators. You have 3 analog oscillators from Dreadbox and 3 digital oscillators from PolyEnd. You can control 3 oscillators at a time using this section, and this button determines whether you're controlling the analog oscillators or the digital ones. For each of the 3 oscillators, both digital and analog, you've got 4 core shapes: saw, pulse, triangle, and sine, with some extra goodies for each. Now, in case this crossed your mind, let's compare the digital and analog oscillators. This is digital saw and analog. Back to digital. Let's look at the square waves. I'll start with analog. Let's try digital. Analog. Digital. A pronounced difference with saw, slightly less with pulse. Let's try triangle. A little more subtle. And then let's go for sine. Even less of a difference, I think. So you can probably tell the difference between the two, and if you can't, well, you just saved yourself a world of hurt needing to buy analog gear, though there is the grid, of course. So those are the core oscillators. There's also a noise generator with variable filtering, which is cool. You can transpose each of the oscillators and then either tune them by semitones or fine-tune them, which is handy for nice big unison sounds. This kind of stuff. Or of course create chords. So those are the core shapes and oscillators. Each of the analog and digital oscillators have extra features. Let's take a look at those. On the analog side, the square wave has variable pulse width, and the duty cycle goes from 50% to 95%. There's no dedicated pulse width modulation knob, but it's easy to take an LFO and assign it to pulse width. By carefully selecting the rate, the amount, and the center position, you can create some pretty interesting effects with this. And of course, the good old PWM sound. There's hard sync for oscillators 2 and 3. And you can modulate this as a target as well, whether with an envelope or an LFO. And you can use oscillator number 3 for FM, either for oscillators 1 and 2 or for the filter cutoff. I'll get these guys going into sine waves. Right, so simple exponential FM. So let's move on to the digital oscillators. Now, while they don't have the sync and FM bells and whistles of their analog brothers, they do have one little trick up their sleeves, which is wavetable capabilities. Now, don't expect serum or massive style features, but there's a bit of wavetable fun to be had here. If I activate digital and then rather than scroll through the 4 waves, just hit this one more time. So they cycle through the 4 shapes and wavetable. So the way you use wavetables in Medusa is you go into the menu, choose any one of 20 different wavetables. Now, each of these wavetables has different waves that you can cycle through. Now, this is simple wavetable cycling. There isn't a morph feature here. So you can sort of hear the steps if you modulate this manually, especially with the waveforms that are maybe a bit more extreme. This one's more subtle, but let's say, yeah, this guy too. Yeah, this is a little bit more extreme. So there's no morphing here, but it's an interesting kind of effect that you can play with and modulate as well. So you can either treat this as a bank of additional sounds. This one's nice. Or of course you can modulate the transitions through the wavetable. Now currently you can't load up your own wavetables, so these 20 are what you get, but at Superbooth PolyEnd hinted that they might open this up in the future, so who knows. Okay, let's move on to the filter. You've got 3 modes to this filter: 2-pole low pass, 4-pole low pass, and high pass filter. Let's listen to them real quick. This with no resonance. The really nice thing here is as you turn up the resonance, it doesn't impact the bottom end at all. So you can see I'll start edging it up. Literally 0 impact. Resonance will self-oscillate if you're into that. Quite abruptly, but you can fine-tune it. Let's listen to the 4-pole filter. With resonance. And the high pass filter. And there's nice resonance on this one too. The filter also has a variable tracking feature which lets you track the cutoff frequency to the keys you play in varying degrees, including playing the filter resonance chromatically if you are so inclined. Okay, cool. Let's move on to modulation. And on the mod side, you've got 5 LFOs and 5 envelopes. And if you say, who needs 5 LFOs? I'll say, clearly you haven't seen my LFO tips and tricks video. But beyond that, there's no mod matrix in Medusa. Instead, they've chosen a more simpler 1 target per LFO and envelope system. Once you've assigned a modulation destination, you can't reuse that LFO or envelope for another destination. So having 5 of each comes in quite handy. Let's take a quick look at the envelopes. All 5 envelopes are 5-stage envelopes with an additional delay stage before the attack, decay, sustain, and release stages. You can loop all 5, so they can basically become additional LFOs or rhythmic modulators if you like. There are dedicated filter and amplitude or VCA envelopes, and 3 others that you can assign either by holding the envelope and twisting the knob that you want as a destination, or by selecting a target from this menu. Right, and quite a few options to choose from. as you can see here. So I can select my target through here, but let's say that I wanted this envelope to control the pitch of oscillator 2. I just select it like this. So I can play with the shapes here and see the result on screen. But let's say that I just wanted a simple attack decay envelope for the frequency of oscillator 2 along with my hard sync effect. So that's how you use the envelopes to modulate parameters. So on to LFOs, very similar situation here if I want LFO 1 to modulate my pitch, and we're good to go. One of the really nice things here is that you can see visually on the screen exactly what each of the 5 LFOs and envelopes is doing. Right, this is my amp envelope. Let's say that I wanted to make the attack a bit slower, or add release. I would see that right here on screen. Very, very useful. Each of the LFOs can either be free running or synced to the tempo of your sequence. And a really nice feature of the LFOs is that they don't have just one simple shape, but rather you can morph between the different shapes. Now, this is something I actually showed how to do in last week's video, but I've never seen this actually implemented as a built-in feature in a synth. Pretty cool. One last thing about both the LFOs and envelopes. Currently, the modulation amounts aren't bipolar, they only go up. The LFO does cycle up around 0, but envelopes only go in a positive direction, so if you wanted to go negatively, you'd probably need to use to start your envelope with a decay. Another nifty little feature that I wish other synth manufacturers would copy is the way that Medusa deals with knob positions. Now, synths with presets are great, but one of the disadvantages here is that once you change your preset, the knob position, the physical position, doesn't always reflect what its actual position is. So let me explain what I mean. I'll load just any preset, and now by definition, the filter cutoff, for example, of this preset will probably not be where this knob is located. Now, if you want to find out where it is, just touch the knob a little bit, and you can see the empty dot here reflects the real position of the filter cutoff. I can always churn it, pick it up, and then see the actual filter cutoff point change. Now, there's also a setting that lets you take immediate control as you turn the knob, but I personally prefer it this way to see where a parameter is and then have the choice if I want it to change rather than have it change abruptly. Okay, let's move on. The last major feature that I want to talk about is Medusa's polyphonic or paraphonic capabilities, depending on your definition of those terms. Now, Medusa has 6 oscillators, and these can be configured and played in one of 3 ways. In M or monophonic mode, all 6 oscillators move together and transpose along a single note that you play on the grid or an external keyboard, sharing one VCA envelope and one filter or filter envelope. So as I bring more oscillators up, they just play together. But if I want to play multiple notes at the same time, and I'm not talking about just transposing them here through the oscillators, all I need to do is move into P1 to play 3 notes and P2 to play 6 notes at a time. In P1 mode, you can play 3 notes at a time, and each of the analog and digital oscillators are layered one on top of the other, resulting in the ability to play 3-note chords. Now in this case, all 3 notes share the same filter. But they each get their separate VCA envelope. So essentially, this envelope is split up into 3 separate envelopes with 2 extra additional hidden envelopes coming into play. And this, of course, works with external keyboards too, but you do hit a limit after 3 notes. P2 works the same way, 1 filter, but now you have 5 additional VCAs for a total of 6 VCAs, letting you play 6 notes. Right, pretty awesome. So while technically this isn't Polyphony because all the notes share the same filter, it's pretty darn close. So that's pretty much it in terms of the front panel features. Let's talk about connectivity. You've got MIDI in, out, and through on the back, and MIDI over USB as well. Phone and line outputs with levels for each, and you can feed external audio into the filter. So that's pretty much Medusa in a nutshell. Let's look at some pros and cons. Let's start with the cons. I'm reviewing Medusa very early in its life cycle. Now, as I was going through this, I discovered a few bugs, but most of them were fixed within a day. So if that's an indication of anything going forward, it seems like PolyEnd and Dreadbox are very keen on making sure this thing works extremely well. Other cons are features that I wish Medusa had and it currently doesn't, and that may or may not apply to you. For example, things like MPE support on MIDI out, pattern chaining, transposition, a random or sample and hold LFO, and an arpeggiator. Now, I asked PolyEnd about these, and they said that some of those are already planned, and that for others it ultimately depends on consumer demand. So I guess that makes sense. None of them are impossible. It's just a matter of prioritizing what people who buy this want. On the pro side, the build seems very solid. The pads have no moving parts, so I assume they can take a beating. And most importantly, Medusa is a very refreshing and innovative new take at the synth genre. Now, in the past, partnerships between two separate entities have produced legendary instruments, things like Gibson and Les Paul, Akai and Roger Lynn for the MPC. Time will tell if this partnership between PolyEnd and Dreadbox will be as impactful, but it's really nice to see companies come together, bring their strengths, and create something interesting, brave, and very, very different. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Hit like if you learned something, and subscribe, and ring the little YouTube bell if you want to make sure you see more clips from me. And if you want to know everything I know about synths and support this channel, check out my book on Patreon. Thanks very much for watching.